Fáilte. Welcome to today's talk with Professor Noam Chomsky, which is part of this year's special online virtual Féile, brought to you by Féile and Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. Noam Chomsky is no stranger to West Belfast. We've had him there a couple of times. I think it was 1995, and then I can't remember exactly. When was the next time?
93.
93 was it? And when was the second time?
About 10 years later, I think.
Yeah. And you drew massive crowds, especially on the first occasion, but both occasions. You are probably drawing massive crowds now, except that we can't see them. But I just like to say that most people, when they're introducing speakers, say things like, well, our speaker needs no introduction. Well, there's nobody I can think of that is a truer statement. You know, viewer, why you're here. You know Noam Chomsky, that's why you've tuned in to see this. So the plan is that Noam's going to speak on the issue of the world after the pandemic. And after he's spoken for a while, we'll see if there's a way we can continue the debate between him and me. So Noam, over to you. It's a pleasure to have you here. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I really wish I was with you in person. I've really enjoyed my last trips to Belfast. We're living in a very unusual moment. In fact, a unique moment in human history. We are literally facing the question, which has to be answered very soon, as to whether organized human society will survive on Earth. That's an urgent question, never arisen before in human history. It can't be evaded now. And we're talking about the near future. There are several, at least 4 major crises which are converging, kind of a confluence right now. They all have to be faced, or we're basically finished. Of the 4, the least significant is the pandemic. It's horrible. It's causing enormous suffering and damage. We will, sooner or later, emerge from it at terrible cost if we don't consider the roots of the pandemic and eviscerate those roots. There'll be another one coming back that's much harsher. There've been a series of coronaviruses in the last couple of decades. Some of them, like this one, have been highly contagious, but not highly lethal. Others, like Ebola, were highly lethal, but not terribly contagious. One's going to come along that's both. And in that case, the disaster would be far worse than today. It can be prevented, just as this one could be prevented, but only if you pay attention to what has to be done. In 2003, after the SARS epidemic, which was contained, scientists warned that another coronavirus is almost certain to come. They described what has to be done. But it's not enough to know. Somebody has to do something about it. Well, who's going to do something about it? Could be the big drug companies. They have resources. They're super profitable, primarily because of the mislabeled free trade agreements, which give them monopoly pricing rights and so on. So anyway, tons of money, great laboratories, but they're blocked by something called capitalism. Capitalist logic says you're not allowed to spend money to prepare for something that's likely to happen 10 years from now. You have to spend money on what's profitable for your shareholders and CEOs tomorrow. So they're blocked. Well, there's the government. which does most of the basic research on vaccines and drugs anyway. Again, endless resources, wonderful laboratories, they're blocked by something called neoliberalism. You may recall when Reagan came into office, his first words were, "Government is the problem, not the solution." Thatcher chimed in with her version, "No society, just individuals." Well, what does it mean to say government is the problem? It means that decisions have to be taken out of the hands of government. They don't disappear, they go somewhere else, into the hands of private, unaccountable power. That's what the slogan means. Government is flawed. It has some responsiveness to people, and that's dangerous. We have to move everything into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies which have no influence from the public. That's called neoliberalism. Reagan, Thatcher, the last 40 years we've been living with. So government is blocked. So therefore there's no way to react. Well, in fact, government wasn't totally blocked. So under Obama, one of the first things Obama did when he came into office was to call a meeting of the Presidential Scientific Advisory Board, which was set up by the first President Bush. And he asked them to prepare a pandemic preparation program, because everyone knew a pandemic's coming. And they did. They prepared a program. It was implemented. Wasn't really the total preparation. It was something. 4 years later, Trump came into office. 8 years later, 2017. First days in office, he disbanded the pandemic protection program. Disbanded it. This is an anti-science administration. Hates science. So this was dismantled. There were programs of American scientists working in China with Chinese colleagues to identify coronaviruses, caves in China. Trump dismantled it. Every program was dismantled. There was repeated warnings that something's coming. Doesn't matter. You have to pour money into the pockets of the rich. That's the only thing that matters. Fate of the population doesn't matter. So when the pandemic hit, it was very striking to see what happened. Some countries that are where the governments have some concern for their populations reacted very quickly, have it pretty much under control. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, pretty much controlled. Europe waited a while, too long, but finally got it under control. Canada, very similar to the United States, got it under control. The United States is off the spectrum, totally off the spectrum. Now, the leadership combines malevolence with incompetence. So won't go through the details, but it's a disaster. So much so that Europe won't even permit Americans to visit, because the United States is a pariah state, thanks to Trump's wrecking ball, which has turned neoliberal savagery, which is bad enough, into a total catastrophe. Now, right now, scientists are telling us the same things they did in 2003. Another probably worse pandemic is coming. Here's what you have to do to prepare for it. We have the same problems. Capitalist logic bars the drug companies. Neoliberalism bars the government. So are we going to let it come and destroy us? Or are we going to deal with these problems? That's the question we face about the pandemic. The least significant of the crises that we face. Let's turn to the more significant. All of you know about the famous doomsday clock set every January by analysts to determine how far we are from midnight, which means terminal disaster. We're all done. It started right after the atom bombs. oscillated over the years. Every year that Trump has been in office, the minute hand has moved closer to midnight. 2 years ago, it reached the closest point to midnight it had ever been. This year, in January, this is before the pandemic was known, the analysts abandoned minutes and moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. Since then, and they gave 3 reasons. One is the threat of environmental catastrophe, which is getting worse. Second is the threat of nuclear war, which is getting much worse. The third is the deterioration of democracy. Now, it sounds as first as if that doesn't belong. But if you think about it for a moment, it does belong. Because the only hope for dealing with the existential crises is a vigorous, functioning democracy with informed citizens making decisions about their lives and fate. What has happened since January? All 3 problems have gotten worse. Trump has escalated the environmental crisis. He is dedicated to destroying life on Earth. Not purposely, just doesn't care. But that's what the program means. Maximize, alone in the world, maximize the use of fossil fuels, eliminate all regulations which might mitigate the crisis and which protect the population. It goes day after day, relentlessly, right under the cover of the crisis. So yesterday, for example, the Trump administration canceled quietly the major environmental protection law instituted by Richard Nixon, the last liberal president of the United States, believe it or not. Nixon instituted a strong environmental policy to block pollution, emissions, and so on. Yesterday, Trump dismantled it. It happens every other day. It's very striking to see the effect. When you free up plants to put fossil fuel plants and others to pollute as freely as they want, of course it has an effect on the world, but has a dramatic effect on the people who live near the plants. Who lives there? People who are too poor to move anywhere else. What's the color of their skins? Black. It's a way to give a further blow against the Black population, which has suffered bitterly from 400 years of repression. Now, Trump comes along, let's make it worse. Actually, this is a political act for his popular base, much of which is white supremacist. It's interesting that during the Trump years, according to the FBI, which monitors terrorism in the United States, of course, when Trump came into office, 20% of terrorism was white supremacist. Today, it's virtually 100%, not by accident. That's the voting part of the voting base. You have to throw scraps to them. This goes on every day. It's malignancy, malevolence combined with, I shouldn't really say incompetence, very competent at serving his masters, the rich and the corporate sector. Pouring dollars into their pockets is the constant legislative program. And it's a very effective confidence man trick. With one hand, you hold up a sign saying, I love you, you're the great working people of the world. With the other hand, you stab them in the back. To carry that off, it's quite a trick. Well, that's one thing. The environmental catastrophe made much worse under Trump. What about the threat of nuclear war? He had already eliminated the INF Treaty. A couple of months ago, the Open Skies Treaty is gone. It goes back to Dwight Eisenhower. Next on the chopping block is the comprehensive test ban treaty. Haven't been any nuclear tests for 28 years. Trump wants to start them again. Let's make the danger to human life as great as possible. The Russians have been pleading to renegotiate the New START treaty, the Majors Treaty. Trump's offering frivolous objections to try to block it. If he's elected, that'll die in early next year. This is a great gift to military industry, which is euphoric, new weapons of destruction, contracts to try to figure out ways to block the weapons we're encouraging others to produce. It's magnificent. I can't get over it. And remember that military industry isn't isolated. It's part of the general corporate manufacturing system. So they love it. It's a way to pour dollars into the pockets of your primary constituency. The fate of the world makes no difference, just as environmental catastrophe makes no difference. What about democracy? Trump is turning the United States into a classic tin pot dictatorship. Now, some people call him fascist. That's wrong. Gives him much too much credit. Fascism was an ideology that had some meaning. This is nothing. This is like some third world neo-colony where a tin pot, which has a military coup every couple of years, and some tin pot dictator does whatever he likes. So the most recent examples are pretty dramatic. Congress, the Republican Congress, had appointed inspectors general to monitor branches of the executive to prevent corruption and malfeasance. They started looking into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington. He purged them all, just got rid of them, fired them. That's not fascist. That's tin pot dictator. The chief federal justice, state attorney, Southern District of New York, the Wall Street area, started looking into the criminal activities of Trump and his associates, fired him, just like that. I mean, the executive branch of the government has been completely cleansed of anyone except sycophantic cowards like Mike Pompeo, who can lick the boss's shoes and can't say anything else. There used to be something called a Senate in the United States, called itself the world's greatest deliberative body. Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, who's really the evil genius of this administration in many ways, has prevented the Senate from doing any deliberation. Bills come to it from the House. It's supposed to deal with, throws them away. The only thing the Senate under McConnell does is pass legislation to enrich the very rich in the corporate sector and pack the judiciary with top to bottom with young, ultra-right justices who will ensure that the extreme reactionary policies of Trump McConnell will persist for at least a generation, no matter what the public wants. That's the Senate. The executive branch is in the hands of a tin pot dictator. The third, so Trump within 6 months has succeeded in increasing the threat of the greatest threats we face. We will ultimately escape the pandemic. We're not going to escape the melting of the Arctic ice sheets. That's going on. It's finished. Longer we let it go on, the worse it gets. Another couple of years of this, we might reach irreversible tipping points. At the very least, it'll be far more difficult to deal with this impending crisis within the brief time we have ahead of us. Same is true of nuclear war. These are very serious problems. If we don't deal with them, the human species can say goodbye to each other. within the next generation or two.
That is frightening. And I don't want to appear like I'm just sort of trying to needlessly find some sort of signs of hope. But still, I'll ask the question, is there another side to the story you're telling? Do you see any signs of hope in the world?
Very much so. In fact, it's dramatic. In the streets of America right now, we're seeing the greatest social movement that ever developed in the United States. Literally. Huge social movement. Has enormous public support. About 2/3 of the public supports it. That's well beyond what Martin Luther King achieved at the peak of his popularity. There's been nothing like this. It's dealing with serious issues. The leading force is Black Lives Matter, but it's much broader. A very impressive solidarity, if you look at it. A lot of interaction, mutual support, serious issues, not just police brutality, but its roots in a very violent society, serious problem. Significant proposals, looking at the the institutional roots of these problems, very significant. And that's just one thing. Yesterday, for example, Biden came out with the program for the election, includes a $2 trillion program on climate change. Very serious program. It was partially written by Sunrise Movement, the young activists who succeeded in putting the Green New Deal on the legislative agenda. They've become part of the planning program. This is all under the Sanders umbrella. Become part of the planning program, partially wrote it, very strongly endorsed it. In fact, if you look at Biden's program now, it's farther to the left than any president as far back as FDR, as Sanders has pointed out. Now, it's not because he had a conversion or because the Democratic National Committee, the Clintonites decided this would be like. They don't like it at all, but they can't stop it because the public has changed. And you can try to marginalize the public. That's a lot of what politics is about, but you can't stop them forever. So this is going on. These are among similar things are happening elsewhere in the world. A couple of months, September, there's going to be the first meeting of the new Progressive International, initiated by the Sanders movement in the United States, by Yanis Varoufakis and the M25 in Europe, trying to bring together progressive forces from around the world, including the Global South. It's meeting in Iceland because the Prime Minister of Iceland is a member of the planning group. There's a lot of promise. Could counter the reactionary international that is being forged, not so quietly, it's very clear, to try to find some geostrategic planning in the chaos of the Trump administration is not easy, but there is one to create a reactionary international, the most reactionary states in the world, headed by Washington, including the Gulf dictatorships, family dictatorships of the Gulf, including al-Sisi in Egypt, who Trump calls his favorite dictator, the worst dictator in Egypt's history, including Israel, which has moved so far to the right that you need a telescope to find it. It has long had tacit relations with the reactionary Arab states, the Gulf dictatorships. Now they're coming out into the open. Moving to the east, Modi's India, brutal authoritarian state, just crushing Kashmir, carrying out actions to dismantle Indian democracy, turn it into a Hindu nationalist, extreme religious state. Perfect member of the team, so they join. In Europe, you have Orban's Hungary, another favorite, dismantling democracy. In Italy, there are people like Salvini, who's a perfect candidate, gets his kicks from watching refugees drown in the Mediterranean. He's a great member. He'll be in it. In England, maybe they can get Neil Farage manages. So let's put all this together in a reactionary international. There are other members that can be countered by a progressive international of people. Now, this goes back to the original question. How do we get out of the pandemic world? Actually, there are two forces contending. There's one force, is basically this. The people who created the system in which we are now suffering. They initiated the neoliberal plague, which has been devastating for populations wherever it's been applied. Very good for some people, for the planners. Like in the United States, by now, 0.1% of the population, not 1%, 0.1% have 20% of the wealth. 70% of the population get by from paycheck to paycheck with nothing to spare in case there's an emergency. That's neoliberalism at its perfect peak. England's had its own version of it, intensified by the ludicrous austerity programs of New Labour and Tories, which harmed England enormously. Europe's had its own version. Third world, it's even worse. It's the global south. The ones who created that system, of course, want to perpetuate it. They've benefited from it enormously, and they're working daily to do that. What I described about yesterday's announcement is just one step. Every day there's another one. Let's try to put in place permanently a system like the one that's devastating the world but enriching us. So they're relentless, internationally and domestically in each country. Then there's the others, the population, those who are in the streets in the United States, the mutual aid groups that are growing up all over the world to support each other in the crisis, the Progressive International, much else. And the question is, it's kind of class war on an international scale. And the question is, who prevails? That'll be the answer to what kind of world comes in.
I shift this view here to the gallery view. I was giving you the lead there for telling us something a bit more uplifting, and now I'm going to switch sides again and say, but the problem is that this reactionary international has everything on its side, well, almost everything on its side. It's got momentum, it's got state power, it's got money, it's got years of practice. And, I mean, you could be a cynic and say, okay, Students for a Democratic Society came and went. Martin Luther King came and went. The Occupy movement came and went. Black Lives Matter maybe will go as well. And meanwhile, the reactionary international keeps on thriving. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I believe that, but what do you say to such pessimism?
History. That's the history of class war. All of the visible power is on one hand side, in the hands of the owner class. They've got all the wealth. They've got the states. They don't always win. They often lose. And they know that they're in trouble. Right? First of all, we live in this. This has always been true. And there have been victories. So I'm old enough to remember the Depression, okay? all the power was on one side. The working class the working class had been crushed in the United States in the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson had been very lively, vibrant labor movement. Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare virtually wiped it out. 20s, it was dormant. In the 1930s, when I was a kid, after a couple of years, 5 years it took, the labor movement started to reorganize. So you got CIO organization, became very militant and vibrant, got to the level of sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes are terrifying for the ownership class for a very simple reason. They're one step before saying, get lost. We don't need you. We can run this thing by ourselves. We don't need you to boss us around. That's frightening. Okay, at that point, you started getting the New Deal reforms, which were very significant. There's some kind of a social democratic state, very important. That's why since Reagan and Thatcher, they're trying to dismantle them, but because they were so important. But they won. Let's take Martin Luther King. Very interesting history. Wonderful person. Bitter battles based on popular struggle. He didn't invent the civil rights movement. He would have been the first to tell you he was riding on a wave. There was young SNCC workers, black workers, kids going out into the Alabama to try to encourage people to vote, even when they're being threatened with lynching and death, facing death themselves. And they created the basis for the movement. King did a wonderful job standing up for it, reached a point where legislative victories were achieved. They were significant. Then King made his bad mistake. He came to the North. He said, I'm not just going to attack racist Alabama sheriffs, which is fine. Northern liberals love that. But I'm going to go to where you live and talk about the racism and the poverty where you live. Tried to create a poor people's movement in black and white. None of that. The attack started, popularity declined by the end, and you read the liberal media, he's toast. We don't want that guy. But there were achievements, and they're lasting. Take Occupy. Occupy was a tactic, not a movement, and the tactic was successful. It changed the arena of discussion and debate. Inequality, which is extraordinary, for the first time became a major issue. Okay, that's significant. Moves things a little further. Now take the Sanders movement. It's been a tremendous success. Broke with 100 years of American political history. Again, changed the arena of discussion and debate significantly. It's changing policy. It's driven the Clintonite Democratic Party, which is basically moderate Republicans. It's driven them, much to their distress, to the farthest left the Democrats have ever been. And it can go further through popular action. You keep winning victories this way. And the people who call themselves the masters of the universe know it, and they're scared. Every January in Davos, the masters of the universe, fancy ski resort in Switzerland, the masters of the universe gather, CEOs of major corporations, media figures, other wonderful people. They gather to enjoy themselves at the ski resort, to congratulate each other on how wonderful they are, parties and so on. This last January was different, dramatically different. They were, the theme of the Davos meeting was, we have to do something. The peasants are coming with their pitchforks. We've got to do something about it. So let's present ourselves as enlightened executives who recognize we've made bad mistakes. We've treated you badly. for the last 40 years. We now understand it. We're confessing our errors. We're moving in a new direction. Now we're going to be really good guys. We're going to take care of you. We're going to be concerned with the workers, the stakeholders, communities. You can trust us. Put your faith in us. That was the theme of the meeting. Actually, for people of my age, it's familiar. In the 1950s, this was called the soulful corporation. Corporations are going to become soulful, not just after money and not just greed, but full of passion and humanitarian love and so on. So now, once again, we're going to have soulful corporations. Why? Because the population is not accepting it. You get memos from J.P. Morgan Chase, biggest American bank, saying we've got reputational problems. We better stop funding fossil fuels because our reputations are at stake. And remember, these institutions are very fragile. They rely on obedience and consent. If that's taken away, they're finished, just like the sit-down strikes. Actually, this was pointed out by David Hume, one of the first modern treatises on political philosophy, Foundations of the Theory of Government, 1740 or so, that opens by saying, he says, this is a great miracle to watch how the people who are governed accept their fate, the easiness with which they're controlled by their masters, because power lies in the hands of the governed. The people who are governed have the power. The way the masters rule is by consent. It's by consent only that they manage to rule. If they can get people to consent to their rule, they can hold out, even though it's very fragile, can be taken away from them at any moment. And I think you're asking about hope. Look at history. You see it's happened over and over. Look at the logic of it. It's clear. The masters don't have the power. They may look like it, but they're not the ones who make things work. They're not the ones who produce things in factories. They're not the ones who hold the guns in the police force. They're guys who can hang on because people agree to let them rule. That's it. And that agreement can be taken away.
Okay, I'm glad we got that far, because the tale of woe you listed for us at the start was pretty dismal. I mean, absolutely real, but pretty dismal. Let me switch a little bit, Noam, if you don't mind. I mean, your analysis through all the years has always been global, huge in its outlook. You know, you've taken in the whole world and the politics of the world, but it's also at the same time been very firmly located in the country in which you've lived your life, in the United States. Let me look at the United States for a minute. And, you know, there are all these things that you talked about, whether it's the nuclear issue or the global catastrophe or the pandemic, they all hit different countries in different ways. And in some ways, some of them are hitting the United States really badly at the moment. I said to you just before we started recording, I just read there that the Houston newspaper, what's the Houston newspaper? Chronicle? No. Chronicle had 43 pages of death notices yesterday. I mean, that is catastrophe. So the question I want to ask is, what happens to the United States in all of this, based on all these three issues that you were speaking about? And the reason I'm asking the question is because the United States is so powerful that it's a little bit like, I suppose, Samson in the cathedral, or Samson in the temple, excuse me, that if it all comes down, it comes down on the whole lot of us as well. Do you know what I mean? It's not just America that suffers. If America suffers, the world suffers too. So what's the future for America in all of this?
Well, the United States is very torn. On the one hand, you have Texas, where you saw the Houston Chronicle yesterday. You look at the paper today, you find uprisings of people who are gathering, huge gatherings in bars without masks because I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. I'm going to be a Texan, brave Texan. So you've got that. That's one part of America. The other part of America is in the streets. The Black Lives Matter protest, the Sunrise Movement, young kids who've managed to move the very reluctant government party to a very advanced climate program. That's the other America. So it's an internal war, just like the global war. And there are plenty of things that other countries can do. Now take Europe. Europe has the largest economy in the world, advanced society, educated society, so reasonably decent social welfare institutions. It sits there and takes it. It just says, whatever you tell us to do, we're going to do. Okay? So take, say, the deal with Iran. It's a really serious problem. There could be a major war developing in the Middle East. Huge war, could spread, could have devastating effects. Can it be settled? Sure. There was a program, the JCPOA, the joint program, was working very well. Even American intelligence said, it's working perfectly. International Atomic Energy said, Iran's living up to everything. Working fine. The Trump wrecking ball came in and smashed it. Said, we don't want it. Why didn't he want it? Because Obama set it up. And anything Obama set up, I got to do the opposite. Otherwise, I'm not a great man. So he smashed it, imposed extremely harsh sanctions on Iran, which have no legitimacy whatsoever. There's no reason for anyone in the world to accept them. What did Europe do? They said, we don't like it, but we're going to accept it because you told us to accept it. And we have to be obedient to you. You're our master. So we accept it. That's Europe. Could Europe do something else? Lots of things I can think about. A couple of days ago, for example, China, which happens not to be subservient to the master, not a nice country, I'm not saying that, but are not subservient to the master, made a deal with Iran, a barter deal where Iran provides oil, they provide manufacturing, build ports, and so on. The United States went crazy. How dare you disobey our sanctions? You read the liberal New York Times, said China's confronting us. They're challenging us. We're the owners of the world. We impose sanctions. Therefore, they are the law from God. And somebody says, I'm not going to observe your sanctions. Terrible. It's a challenge. How can we stand this? What does Europe do? It's quiet. How about joining and saying, we're not going to pay attention to your sanctions? Now, that's not easy because the United States controls the international financial system. And if Europe steps out, they can toss Europe out of the international financial system. But Europe could easily get around that by constructing its own. They don't have to be subservient to the United States. It's like David Hume. It's by consent, not by necessity. So there's plenty that Europe could do if it got together, if it got its act together and was willing to stand up. The things that Europe won't do are pretty shocking. So take the pandemic. Germany, advanced industrial society, most successful state capitalist country, did manage to get it under control. They have it pretty well controlled, low death rate and so on. Right to the south of Germany and Austria, another rich country, there's a place called Italy. Northern Italy had a serious pandemic, and mostly because of its very high elderly population, but it was serious. Do you see German doctors going to Italy to help? Actually, you do see doctors going to help from Cuba, the country that the United States has been trying to crush for 60 years, and Europe goes along with it. They sent doctors to northern Italy, not Germany. Okay, that's the European Union, it's called. Does it have to be like this? I don't think so. These are choices, decisions. You can decide. They're in our hands. And this is true all over. If you look at the whole system of global power again, it's fragile. The masters know it. They know how fragile it is. If the rest of the population gets to understand how fragile it is, we can get out of these crises. Otherwise, we're finished.
Okay. You mentioned Joe Biden earlier, and you mentioned that his program is far to the left of many earlier programs, and also farther to the left than you might have expected Joe Biden to be, given the pressures on him. So that could make a difference in terms of all of these crises. It could make some difference. So I suppose the question I'm asking is, will Trump win again?
Well, yesterday I spent an hour on a discussion. It's on the internet. You can find it with run by Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!
Amy was with us at the festival in Belfast last year.
Pardon?
Amy was at the festival in Belfast last year.
Well, she moderated it. It was a discussion with me and Greg Palast, who's a wonderful investigative reporter. And it was about a new book of his. If you have it here, I can show it to you. I don't know if you can read it.
How Trump
stole 2020. Okay. The argument is Trump's already won the election. Not necessarily we can let it happen. And how did he win the election? By stealing votes. It's a massive vote-stealing operation, which Palast has unearthed very solid documentation. It's been going on for years, went on 2016, went on 2000. The Republicans used to be a political party, an authentic political party. Now that's changed. They're just off the spectrum. They know they're a minority party. Trump himself pointed out that if there's ever a free election, Republicans will never win anything again. And they have one technique to stay in power: prevent the wrong people from voting. So millions of votes are stolen, millions, the United States has a system where the state Secretary of State monitors the elections. So if you have a Republican Secretary of State, he can just cancel huge numbers of voters, which by odd coincidence turn out to be in poor and Black and Hispanic areas, or students areas, because they don't want students to vote. Brian Kemp, governor of Georgia, the recent election, is Secretary of State and was running for office as Secretary of State. So he canceled hundreds of thousands of ballots of his opponent, Stacey Abrams, Black woman who would have easily won. Okay, this is happening in state after state, and it's not just Republicans. One of his important discoveries is that in California, which happened to have a Democratic administration, in 2016, the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, working for the Democratic National Committee, canceled a huge number of votes for Sanders. Right? Same technique. We want our guys to win. Well, almost all of this is Republican. And yes, they've already stolen huge numbers of votes. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll make it. It's kind of like the class war. You can overcome it. But power is in the hands of gangsters, thugs and gangsters. No other word for it. They're stealing votes massively, designing techniques so that you can't vote. So, for example, in I think it's Alabama, they say, well, in order to vote, you have to get a new driver's license. And the only way you can get a new driver's license is at the registry of motor vehicles. But by odd coincidence, there aren't any in the places where blacks and Hispanics live. So you're free to vote. It's just impossible. Another technique that's used is called the postcard technique. The state government sends out a postcard. I could show you what it looks like if I could find it here. It's so densely written thing that you can read with a magnifying glass, which is so many different conditions that any sane person would just throw it in the trash can. That's the point of it. And if you don't return that postcard with every line filled in properly, like not an X but a bubble and not an extra mark somewhere, your vote's canceled. Okay, so another couple of million votes go out that way. The United, I don't know about you, but in the United States, you have to register to vote. Most countries, you don't have to register; you just go vote. I think almost all countries, except the United States. Why do you have to register? Because you don't have time to go to the registry if you're a poor working person. You stand in line for 7 hours if you ever get there. So registration, and then your registration card gets thrown out anyway. So a lot of people are thrown out. All of these techniques are used all over the place. In fact, there's something that reporters call the red shift. The red shift is the gap between exit polls and reported results. Okay, the State Department uses exit polls to judge whether foreign elections are legitimate. So if, say, some China or somebody comes out with poll results, we don't believe them. We take a look at the exit polls, because when a guy comes out of the voting booth and says, I voted for so-and-so, 99.9% of the time it's right. Well, you take a look at exit polls and reporting in the United States, there's a gap called the red shift. The exit polls are Democratic, the reporting is Republican, because you got your guys in there who can throw away the ballots from the wrong zip codes. All of this stuff goes on at a massive level. The level of corruption is grotesque. But why don't the courts do something about it? Actually, they do. The courts ban it, gets to the Supreme Court, they authorize it. Supreme Court threw out the Voting Rights Act, threw it out. The court's in the hands of the far right. So at the intermediate levels, you get honest justices who throw all this junk out. Then they appeal, fancy lawyers and so on. You ultimately get to the Supreme Court. They say, fine. It's what's called a tin pot dictatorship. In fact, it's quite striking to compare the United States now with the second most corrupt country in the world, Brazil, which has a president who's a kind of clone of Trump, tries to imitate him. In Brazil, the counterpart to the FBI, the investigative police, began to look into the criminal acts of Bolsonaro's family. He fired the head of the police. Supreme Court intervened and blocked it. That's Brazil. There's still a thin barrier, the court, from becoming a tin pot dictatorship. Okay, same thing happened here. As I said, Trump purged all of the inspectors and the chief federal attorney who was investigating. Did the Supreme Court do anything? No, they looked the other way. That's the difference between the United States and Brazil. What you said correctly, what happens in the United States enormously affects the world. I mean, Trump has managed to damage the United States pretty severely, but it remains the most powerful country in the world. It's the only country in the world, for example, that can issue sanctions that everybody has to obey. Ireland can't do that. Germany can't do it. Nobody can. The United States can. Military force overwhelms everyone. The economy is somewhat in decline, but that's kind of misleading. It's good reason to believe that economists are looking at the wrong measure. They measure a country's wealth by gross domestic product, which used to make sense, but it makes much less sense in a globalized world. Another measure, which is more significant, is how much of the wealth of the world is in the hands of nationally based multinationals. Well, one very good young political economist, Sean Starrs, now in Hong Kong, who's done extensive work on this, big book coming out, turns out that about 50% of the world's wealth is in the hands of US-based multinationals. So when you get an Apple cell phone, it's put together in China under the control of a Taiwanese company, Foxconn. But the profits don't go back to China. They go back to Apple. Almost all the profits go back to Apple, which fortunately doesn't have to pay taxes because they can set up a room in Ireland, which they say is probably the size of my study, with maybe some secretary, and they say we're an Irish company, so they don't have to pay taxes. Actually, tens of trillions of dollars are stolen that way every year. It's a great con. I mean, the capitalist class knows what it's doing. They're not stupid. But this means that the wealth is in the hands of US-based multinationals. They're first or sometimes second in just about every category. So yeah, what happens in the United States is very important. It can change in the United States. It's a battle. The world doesn't have to accept it. That's also a struggle.
Very topical, Noam, because the European Union appealed the Irish decision not to tax Apple and the European Court, and today the European Court refused that appeal. So Apple does not have to pay millions and millions of dollars of tax in Ireland because of this one little room you're talking about. Listen, this is what has happened, is what I expected to happen. I feel like we're just starting. I feel like we need another hour or two, but we don't have it. We've divided the festival up into 1 hour slots.
Okay.
And it only remains for me in a minute or so I have left to say, no, thank you very, very much. Thank you to misquote slightly Paul Simon. Thank you for being still crazy after all these years. Thank you for still fighting. Thank you for giving us hope. Thank you for giving us analysis. And just to say, as I've said to you before, you have a welcome in Belfast anytime you want. If you want to give a talk Christmas morning, we'll set it up for you. You're welcome here. You're as good as a citizen of West Belfast. Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.
Thank you.